I was invited also to give a kind of maybe a tribute talk about Cedric on Wednesday. But there was another important figure that Krezmer mentioned, and there is also a commemorative plaque just outside this building, which is Nigel Whiteley. So the late Nigel Whiteley was a historian, architectural art historian, who participated to that inaugural, you could say, edition in 1990 that Krezmer mentioned yesterday. And there was this kind of maybe these roles about the workshop and the seminar part. I like to think of them as being part of the same kind of conversation, but I'm going to, let's say, defend a bit, books and words and maybe how history sometimes gets a bad rap and can be very creative. I think it's a very important material to think about the present and projecting the future, to recall the past. I'm not going to be overly, let's say, didactic, and that's why I would like to refer to some I think, histories which are very creative. And I think creative for design and also for our theme, okay? So just a quick, Nigel Whiteley, you see here in the middle with Krezmer on the square, and Vinko Penicic, Krezmer's associate, on the square in Zagreb, and who wrote also this preface. I think he would agree also. I had the fortune of being a participant in one of the workshops that he organized. I would say my organization of the lecture is a little bit different, but what I was very impressed was sitting down with him during the day, how we could adapt his lectures to what was happening during the process. And I think that's also a good lesson about books or articles should not be just about what the author thinks, but should put out things there to make you question the way you think. And it could be what he called a kind of intelligent carpet bag. So useful kind of bits and pieces of material that maybe can inspire you, can maybe question what you're doing, maybe oppose, but at least kind of generate some kind of stimulus to kind of be more critical of what you're doing, at least even if you don't agree. So this is one book of a lot of publications, but one thing I like about just this book, which I think came from Nigel's PhD research, is the title, Design for Society. And giving equal weight to those three words, capital on the for, is that architecture or design, already a kind of larger field, putting architecture, you see there, appliances, hi-fi, all those kind of maybe commercial designs that are part of our environment, as much a part of the home as maybe the hardware which we often associate with buildings, with architecture proper. And so what I like about this idea of service, but also the idea that you're designing about an idea of living together. And all these, a bit like the quote that Krezmer mentioned about creating, quoting again Cedric Price, socially beneficial environments. And so that idea, I think, is very much present in this publication. Another maybe kind of reference that became interesting about how to think creatively about history is this book by American paleontologist Stephen Gould, who asked a very interesting question. He said that if you rewound the tape, I mean, at that time we were in the 80s and 90s when he was publishing his work, if you rewound the history of life, would the outcome be the same? His answer was no, because that there was so much contingency. The universe is constantly in a kind of dynamic situation, and there are so many variables that are constant experience and keeping it open-ended. So there is a kind of co-authorship. Nothing is finished, And he even distinguished what he called the work from the text. Here he talks about the text being something never-ending, constantly adapting to new variables, a bit like Stephen Gould's History, where you could change something and the outcome would be different. You know, sometimes you have these films where there is kind of three storylines which converge or maybe go in different directions. Well, Barth was thinking about that in terms of literary practice. How could you write and really include the reader as a kind of co-author, as a kind of participant? And I think that's maybe today all the more relevant, at least in the field of architecture and planning. Someone who definitely understood maybe this kind of performative approach to their practice was Joan Littlewood. So Joan Littlewood we have not mentioned, but Joan Littlewood is maybe one of the principal authors of the Fun Palace. The Fun Palace, we talk about Cedric Price being the designer, the architect, but the brainchild often, we say, it was Joan Littlewood. In fact, this is really a kind of joint creativity, and I think it's very important. She's not the only figure, but definitely someone who initiated this project to open up the boundaries of culture in very different ways, and it's still very relevant between, let's say, high art, lowbrow entertainment, and one of her sources was really popular entertainment in the kind of music halls, what they called variety shows, where things are kind of mixed up, but there are places of entertainment for the working class. She was very interested in mixing this kind of idea of interaction with the audience, where you could be in a beer hall, not even listening to maybe the music or shutting off, but in those places were connected to the everyday life. And she felt that art somehow had disconnected. There was a gap, how to get closer to the audience, to how to get closer to society. Well, there were different ways, and I think, in a way, this picture for me also talks about the maybe childlike qualities that she injected in her work. You see her up top on the roof playing, but she was always trying to go beyond the boundaries of theater, but at the same time bring society more into the theater space. And I think architecture should work in those two ways. You should reinforce it, listen, bring society different ways we can look at that. For example, stand-up comedy. We mentioned stand-up comedy, jokes are important. Cedric Price said, the Bauhaus is great, but they forgot a few very important people. They forgot the joker, they forgot the cook. There were all these different figures a bit considered to be part of mass entertainment, and yet these were the people who are in the same space as the audience. Why? Well, Joan Littlewood is known to be one of the, let's say, inventors of really the theater of improvisation. She tried to break down what you call in theater talk, basically the fourth wall. You know, we're in a kind of very frontal situation where you're there, where the audience is just listening, in a bit in an illusion like looking at the cinema, seeing a picture and somehow being absent. Well, she wanted to break that wall to have interaction. And where did that exist? That existed in stand-up comedy. Why? Because stand-up comedy was a kind of infill art. It was kind of, you would have a few shows, and then you would shut the curtain, and then you would bring in a stand-up comic to kind of make a few jokes between the next show. So he was in the same, or she, in the same space as the audience. They often got food thrown on them, but they would interact with the audience, and that interaction really interested Joan Littlewood. She would find her actors in some of these spaces, like striptease clubs, cabarets, these places where there was really this contact with the audience, to not have a kind of script, a kind of idea of planning, but to adapt to that interaction. And I think that idea of play, idea of performance, improvisation is very relevant for architecture. So you see these kind of situations where you have people kind of mingling, meeting, eating, and music, and things, all these. And this was really one of the sources of inspiration for the Fun Palace, which I'll talk a little bit about later. A little bit more about Joan Littlewood. I mentioned here one of her main actors that she found in the striptease club. I wanted to talk a little bit about how she brought in, let's say, society. This is one of her most important works, or well-known, Oh, What a Lovely War, which is a satire on World War I and war in general. And she would use projections press clippings, news flashes, things that were happening outside about all the atrocities of the war. And at the same time, have this musical hall comedy. The soldiers were dressed in clown costumes, making this kind of connection. So in a way, this kind of mix also had a real political and critical edge to it. This mix was not just fun. She talked about it. I mean, the Fun Palace, she said it was a laboratory of fun, but this was serious fun. It was talking about society, but also critiquing what was happening outside. And at the same time, she would take her troupe outside the theater. She would do parades, she would do festivals, and a very interesting, and this goes very much to kind of street theater, a lot of things which are very much about community. And she was trying to engage her theater to regenerate also the spaces around her theater. And this was a very important idea in the Fun Palace. Now, we often think of the Fun Palace ending in 1967 when basically in East London, if you are unfamiliar with the project, one of the main sites was projected in East London where the Olympic Games in 2012 took place. And so the project never happened. There was a refusal. We don't want all these people coming. They will be noisy. This is a problem. It was a very ambitious project, but it had a continuity. We often think about all Centre Pompidou. We think about a lot of projects we know, like Vassal, recent Pritzker laureates talk about the Fun Palace, but there is also another legacy in these other projects, and one of this is the playground projects from Joan Littlewood. Joan Littlewood planned a series of playgrounds around the theater as the kind of evolution of the Fun Palace. And the Fun Palace over time, also in Cedric Price's work, was broken up into fragments, into small playgrounds, into smaller projects, maybe as a kind of way to be more reactive and to actually engage more of the community rather than a megastructure. And so they changed also their process, but there are these really kind of parallel stories happening. And what you see about here about the Funsters, which she called her team of youth, where she enlisted not only to kind of invent games, to think about using these spaces, but actually build these spaces, to kind of clean them up, to be kind of responsible citizens, thinking again that, you know, she already started in 1964 doing this before when the Fun Palace started. So it was not something just in the aftermath to downsize. These were parallel projects. So in a way, what I'm trying to talk about is a little bit not only the life of people, but the life of ideas. Ideas are important to come to be very specific, site-specific, material. You have to really understand a place, but ideas of architects take time to cultivate. You have themes, you have things that you try out, you test, and you come back to them in different contexts. And I think the life of this kind of very legendary and very strange project, the Fun Palace, has a lot of versions. You see Joan Littlewood posing with a picture, a poster from Cedric, one of the photo montages, and actually putting into action the program that she imagined, this kind of really kind of crazy program that was each day updated with clowns, with serious theater, with science, everything coming from different experts, but also even Cedric gave lectures to her theater troupe, really a transdisciplinary or a kind of cross-disciplinary project. And I think that's also maybe, even if we don't talk about it directly, we saw how there's kind of intersection with play and art and architecture or even landscape is important, part of that heritage. So just a kind of very quick, I'm not an expert on playgrounds or the history of it, but maybe it can be helpful to think about the past to where we are now, how different it is, and maybe where we are heading. So a very important or well-known playground project is Aldo van Eyck's playground projects after the Second World War. Playgrounds were not just, you know, using derelict space. It was a way to create hope for the future. That generation using kind of unused spaces, and play was really about self-empowerment. And where to start? Well, start at that age where education could be outdoors, could be fun, and it could also be a way to contribute to quality public space. So these spaces were also, you could say, multi-generational. They also happen, and sometimes we ignore these qualities of fun, which are not just the hardware, which is, the atmosphere. Is it wet? Is it in different seasons? There are a lot of playgrounds, I know in Paris, for example, in the Citroën Park, fountains, which have become improvised playgrounds because they are kind of attractive in hot seasons. There are also this kit of parts. I'm using the word from the Fun Palace, that artists like Isami Noguchi imagined sculptures like pieces of playgrounds that could be inserted into the urban fabric. He didn't realize very many, let's say, playgrounds, but he did develop a lot of these projects. And I think what we were talking about, or even in the lecture from Taka and Yui, where we saw Buna and Shi running up and down one of the sculptures. In a way, it is this kind of blurring the distinction between an object as a kind of art object that you look at, like a painting on the wall, and something you engage with, and even in a kind of a very physical way, which is this kind of fun or edutainment kind of way. If there would be something that, kind of really drove Joan Littlewood in her work, and she said it herself, it was about pleasure. And it's not a mistake that, not by chance, that Cedric Price, his first lectures was, how do you plan for pleasure? So pleasure was something that was a driving force in all their projects together, making reference to pleasure gardens, these spaces of mass entertainment. There are more recent examples, which the question of materials, low-tech materials. So when we ask you the question like, why do you use this material? Is this really a part of this place? Well, there are these questions of recycling, things that somehow reflect a space. It can be a somewhat derelict space. And I think sometimes using the space, you should think about other dimensions, all the senses. I like this project from Rural Studio, who's an office that really engages in community work, but it's also about making noise. I mean, kids maybe love to make noise, and maybe also this kind of imaginary space where you can shout, make loud noise in a space above, or actually use it like an instrument. That's another way of thinking about play. So I go back to this idea that Roland Barthes said, well, musicians, in a lot of arts, we consider the person who's actually practicing, let's say, the space or the instrument is really part of the author. We're not just, composing the space and then leave it after. So this is something that, of course, goes a bit beyond this, but I think in a way, the life of an idea is a little bit about that. Thinking that you leave it a bit open-ended. You leave it somehow, how much do you design and how much you need to do to also leave room for others that they somehow can somehow appropriate the space, somehow imagine, and this is a project which is still in progress by Assemble, who have revisited a kind of legacy, a very English legacy, which is adventure playgrounds, which were, if there are paradigms you can imagine, I mean, the playground kind of culture comes from a certain critique of industrial life in the 19th century, where, we're passing from the idea of work. And so play is in a way a critique where, for social well-being, we need these spaces of recreation. We're living in the 1960s and 70s. We come into a consumer society, a society of leisure. So play somehow also has this bigger dimension, not just, for children, it speaks about society. And so this revisiting this legacy of why is now public space so safe, all about, standardization. You look at children's playground equipment becoming extremely boring, maybe. And there is this legacy about, autonomy, self-empowerment, education, an incredibly interdisciplinary kind of body of work produced basically 50s to the 70s, and then a shift in the 80s and 90s where things get very safe and friendly. So why am I telling you all this and talking about the Fun Palace? Not just because, fun is in the word and in the project, because I think it kind of encapsulates all these different tendencies. You can see in the Fun Palace not only, the idea you see here, where they advertised it. I mean, for a very long time, they put no images up. They called it a toy. You say, we're going to build a toy the city can use. And the idea is not a kind of destination. I mean, Price and Littlewood said it's not a mecca, it's a launching pad. It's something that we just kind of want to kind of spur your imagination to open up things, but then somehow enhance your own life. So it's a kind of catalyst, maybe in terms of urban regeneration, but also from a kind of individual point of view, the idea of self-empowerment. You see the kind of fantasies, you know, fun is really about also being imaginative, mixing things, jukebox information. So the idea of using maybe familiar objects in different uses. You see these kind of different proposals. And I put that purposely there because, you know, this idea of keywords is not just, you know, to keep it like a history record. It's like creating a menu where you can find the combinations which you think are interesting. It opens up the imagination. When we collectively, like a collage, put those words out, you start to read across them and you open up different avenues. The Fun Palace, even the title, fun is not an invention, palace is not, but when you put them together, it is invention. There is something unique. So invention is not always about trying to make something that has never been seen before. It's also creating new relationships, and even in words. So this is definitely, for me, interesting, both in the project and both in the process of talking about it, the process really of engaging citizens. Words were really important from the beginning. And you can see even in the writing, as much Joan Littlewood was writing, you see the words success, failure, these were Cedric's handwriting. And they wanted even the booklet somehow to become something a bit do-it-yourself, where it could be interactive. It could be finding a different way of reading and somehow using the different consultants, for example, artists like John Mayhale, who were interested in making interactive books. So all these ideas were kind of present in different fields and somehow mingling together. The idea of a University of the Streets, that was another name that they gave to the Fun Palace. You see here all these kind of different ideas, not unlike our post-its and our you see science playground, you see these things, but trying to kind of push the boundaries of what is maybe culture. And this I'll talk about it again with Cedric. I'm not going to focus too much on Cedric Price today. But from the very beginning, before he met Joan Littlewood, this is what he was interested in, opening up education, opening up culture, and finding, pushing the boundaries and the limits. So this is probably the most famous image of the Fun Palace. This was in the flyer that we saw, which talked about this kind of toy. But you see this kind of, basically, it was like a shipyard, a kind of structure where things could be scrapped, rebuilt, a kind of, these kind of cranes could move and shift things around. You had this platform. It was basically not so different in a sense. When we have a theater staging, you have a lot of technical equipment for a performance. And that's not necessarily what is in the foreground, because you stage a performance. In a way, the Fun Palace, you know, this whole high-tech movement of turning things inside out was a little bit about, you know, this architecture of spectacle in a kind of positive way. Price talked about it as social infrastructure, and I think that's a good way to also think about sometimes what you're proposing, whether it's in the evening as a kind of the Fun Palace apparently was also inspired by Times Square in New York, but creating effects, creating a kind of atmospheres, and not necessarily a kind of showy monument, and not a symbol or something that is static, but something which creates an effect, an atmosphere, not unlike staging a performance. So I mentioned, you know, this legacy. We know somehow the influence, even if it has not been explicitly, you know, admitted, the link to Centre Pompidou. I mentioned the Fun Palace with reference to Palais Tokyo. It's the architects themselves who talk about Fun Palace. There was a lot of different takes on it. Even maybe you're familiar with the Fun Palaces, which is a festival started by a theater So coming again from the, this other field, more linked to Joan Littlewood, but again, creating an idea of community engagement, opening up art and science, and trying to kind of blur the boundaries. And they're a lot less about kind of buildings, but using what exists, really what exists, the infrastructure there, and just creating this kind of stimulus for creativity with citizens. So, you know, this image I thought was interesting given we were talking about tables and furniture and different things. In a way, it's not about, you know, a sophisticated building, but it's also thinking about what exists and using the resources, whether they're human resources or physical and spatial properties. So I like that's Fun Palace manifesto, and you see about this idea of self-empowerment, which revisits a lot of the manifestos of the 60s and 70s. So this is from the Fun Palaces Festival, talking about somehow empowering. And I think if there's a shift a little bit, maybe you can imagine about, you know, opening a culture. In France, we have this legacy from André Malraux, which is called the Maisons de Culture. But imagine a kind of universal person who could love, you know, classical music, contemporary art, and somehow also popular entertainment, and somehow this universal person. But I think the difference now is to kind of try to find more specific responses, not to try to things to be too universal, but to be specific and also specifically different as a kind of network. I think this is a kind of shift from trying to create a kind of generic cultural community center to be much more site-specific. I like the idea of this kind of idea of activity chart within the process of the Fun Palace. They're very jokey. I won't go into reading, but no one really knows if they had an impact, but at least there was this idea of getting feedback in the process, imagining what could be compatible, what could be interesting to do, and imagining, exploring, and even they created what they called ideas group. A lot of the people from the ideas group shifted to finding, to starting up the Open University. These were sociologists, philosophers, a lot of very important maybe academics and scientists, but they were also, you know, people on the street trying to get as much material to see a little bit to guide the kind of reactivity, the responsiveness of what they were proposing. They took those, Price took this into other projects, and these are kind of practices that Joan Littlewood used in her theater troupe. She often did these kind of, you know, training programs with her actors. They had to switch roles to try to find, and so in a way, there is again this kind of, you know, process of research and development which goes into the craft, and I think, again, opening it up to other fields can be very interesting. So what did Price do after the Fun Palace? You know, the Fun Palace stopped in about the 67. There was a lot of critique. He did start a project which is, you know, 64 parallel, Paris Think Belt. I'll talk about it later on. But in 67, when the Fun Palace shut down, he was in Houston, participating in a workshop, planning new schools for new towns. And you see the lineup of tutors. Venturi was there before he had, you know, started to work on Las Vegas. He actually just got married after, and Denise Scott Brown was actually in the jury for the projects. But they had these different tutors working on different actually commissions which were developed by educational consultants. Price basically took a lot of the ideas, both from the Fun Palace and the Potteries Think About adapting it to this new context. This was a site near Chicago, by using the park system, the parks and recreation system, to make it also spaces where you could learn and places for entertainment. So using it for multi-use spaces, some could be temporary, and you see even, it's hard to read, where it often uses the word playground. You know, the idea of play, that it had to be somehow, this is a teaching toy, using that language to somehow enter into the language of entertainment, so that it's not, you know, the classroom typical, but the image in a way using venues like open air cinema and these spaces outdoors as possible parts of the universe. So already you see the kind of fragmentation of the Fun Palace project in different pieces as a kit of parts. It was called a kit of parts, but it was a megastructure. We saw that kind of big image in the section. But little by little, in a lot of projects, already starting in '67, he broke it down, not unlike Joan Littlewood, trying to engage more directly with a new context, but adapting. There are a lot of different things that could mention, which come from, I'll probably come back to it, but it's also marking on the outside. He hated, I mean, one thing that Cedric Price hated was this idea that you would learn in the classroom and then life was outside. So he thought, well, it's a pity that, you know, these tech campuses or these universities are somehow isolated in the countryside, and in the city, the things we're learning, they're there. So why don't you use them? So if you're learning about industry, why don't you somehow create these kind of showcases? Why don't you go to the factories and learn these things closer and get that interaction happening between, let's say, higher education, technical education, and the actual places where these things are produced, and even somehow marking what is in these containers, kind of exposing and using these kind of this architecture as a kind of a way to learn. I'll come back to that. So he got a few different commissions, and actually the programmers who worked on that design charrette in Rice in Houston, who invited all these architects, they selected Price to continue the study in Michigan for this community college called Oakland Community College. And Price, again, was able to deepen his research. Already, a lot of things had changed from the way that he approached the projects. One, I talked about, you know, fragmenting it, using much more existing spaces and adapting it to existing patterns of mobility. We see something very similar to what we saw about how technology could come closer to bringing already what now seems a bit strangely so familiar, remote online teaching and kind of portable kind of technology, but using that so that this kind of a less centralized, you know, kind of network of education could somehow go beyond. So this is before, let's say, the Open University or remote learning. And taking these to different contexts, imagining that with these ideas, not as a finished project, but negotiating between different. So he would create these kind of conferences, industry and commerce. This is something that was lacking, for example, in the early project in Fun Palace. One of the reasons that it was stopped, there was not enough dialogue. And so one of the ideas also in learning was that there would be this experience of cooperation. One project that he created, an association network, is called Polyarch. The idea of creating a network between architecture schools in the UK. So, and this is maybe the very well-known Polyarch bus tour where students would, they kind of customize this, they put drafting tables on the top, and they had this bus trip where they would go around the UK to different schools. The students would present their work there, and then some would hop on the bus or they would get interaction, some would stay. And so this bus trip would somehow connect in a kind of very physical, also kind of hands-on kind of networking experience, but also in a very fun kind of way, this idea of entertaining kind of education. So, but it was not just a UK network. You know, Price was thinking about creating an international network, and also how education wouldn't be reproduced exactly the same in every spot. So how we could be much more specific, how you could have some specialization in some universities. And you know, the typical American kind of tour of Europe that, you know, Le Corbusier and all the architects have done. Well, he proposed something very different, that it was not about, you know, what you should see or what, it was how the students could develop their own itinerary from a subject. So basically, the itinerary he gave a series of phone numbers to each student, depending on, and each student created their own itinerary and trip, and would share that after. And in a way, making this again closer to what they were working and creating something much more individualized rather than the kind of standard package of tour, whether it be London or Europe. So I'm going to end on just this image. One, I think, kind of shows a little bit maybe this is maybe the clearest, let's say, translation of the Fun Palace after it was built. It was demolished, and Price himself refused to have it protected as a kind of heritage monument, saying that basically it had superseded its social validity. But he was always about the Fun Palace was supposed to exist for 10 years and then disappear and maybe reconstructed. So a kind of idea of a catalyst but not to stay as a kind of fixed monument. So this idea of temporary structures. But what I like a lot about this image is that you don't see the architecture. In fact, you see the people using what he called the social infrastructure, sitting there, walking, and maybe, so in a way, maybe it's already there, but maybe it doesn't have to be seen. So it's not this art object or a monument or what you call the very showy kind of symbol. It is about enabling certain practices, enabling people to gather, to socialize, again, creating this idea of society. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Questions, keywords, as you like.
Yeah, before that, can I make questions?
Sure.
Okay, you talked about the Fun Palace. Okay, is there a difference between Fun Palace and the playground for you? Because you just juxtapose these two, and it seems to me you didn't distinguish these two. But for me, it's a very different thing. Fun Palace is a commercial.
Is a what? Commercial?
Much more commercial thing. And that's to get money, basically. But the playground is the one to be provided from society for the kids. So I think there's a big difference. What do you think about it?
No, I actually am arguing the opposite, that there is a continuity.
Continuity.
Whether it's John Littlewood or whether it's, Price, but especially John Littlewood, we consider the playground to be a minor project or something else. I think there's a continuity, and I don't think it was really about a commercial architecture. It was about community centers, reinventing the art centers, which were, to a large extent, financed by the welfare state. So these were public buildings. These were not commercial buildings.
I know, but in public building, it's paid the public.
Yeah.
We pay tax, and the money is used to accept Fun Palace. And so now, just Fun Palace consume money, and Disneyland consume some money. So what's the difference? See, because these days, actually, in this semester, one of my students started designing Disneyland on the center of Tokyo, if it is possible. And just now just we arguing, can Disneyland can be something can serve public service purpose, or just Disneyland is a kind of poison, big game center. So it's a very, very different boundary to see.
Definitely, I think there was a very strong faith, whether it's Manham or Cedric Price, that commercial design could be socially beneficial, and the private side and the money-making side, they created a trust for this project. So they had a lot of benefactors. They had a lot of people who donated money or patrons. So it didn't only rely on public, let's say, local money. They tried to tap into different fundings and also at different levels. So that's kind of interesting. But I agree that the kind of fascination with popular entertainment, the question of money and that part is still a tricky situation. At the time, Price was talking a lot about obsolescence, all these things. These were provocative terms because consumer society was new. So it was really on cutting edge. After 70s, 80s, where there's much more ecological, environmental awareness, they start to change their language and they become aware of also that edge which is not so clear. Why? In the UK, for example, they enter after the welfare state, they changed government. With the Thatcher, privatized a lot of these cultural endeavors. So that shift, they learned that, you know, it's not so easy. Yeah, for sure. So now today, you have to pose the question, yeah.
You know, we found out Disneyland is trying to be more friendly for society these days. They said, you know, now they can get the voucher. They can give the voucher for single mother family. And so, you know, they can, some children from single family can go to Disneyland, which is much more fun than maybe home palace provided by public. So, you know, can our public home palace can beat the Disneyland? You know, I know that there are some, you know, difference, but you know, these days I always get confused because they are trying to be good guy and they're doing good things, and if you go there, you find all kinds of jacuzzi, all kinds of things you can see in the screen now. So
yeah, but
it's a difference.
the Fun, for example, the Fun Palace Festival, which is a community action, is about participating in different neighborhoods, connecting with schools. So I think it's not going to an amusement park and Disney. It's, but today I think you cannot rely completely on the, let's say, public realm as your only client. But this is the tricky nuance that I think publicly led projects can guarantee a certain, let's say, quality in terms of
Yes, exactly.
culture,
Exactly.
whereas if it's completely given over to private ownership,
Yeah,
then you're...
so, you know, I think that we are coming to a very important point. We were talking about the quality, okay? But the quality is very ambiguous word. You know, some people say that the quality is important, but same thing. You know, even the owner of the Disneyland says the same thing. Quality is very important.
Yes.
You know, just we saw you know, people coming to Disneyland. So, you know, always the discussion of,
Yeah.
you know, sometimes, you know, students tend to make some kind of fun, okay? Making slopes and the swings, and then if you put electrics and all kind of power on this the swing, then suddenly it become Disneyland, the biking shaking, you know? So, you know, I'm always have been trying to see the boundary between these two. Is it about money? Is it kind of attitude? Or maybe political issue, maybe socialism or capitalism?
It's clear that I think there is an ambiguity, but Price is definitely very left-wing, a kind of hardcore socialist or labor. But I think with some of the programs that he imagined, there was always the idea there shouldn't be this separation between, let's say, technical education, the money, what you talked about, for example. I think it's very relevant, for example, in Paris or France. Why is all this, you know, high-tech campuses like Saclay not contributing to improving existing cities? So why don't we connect? So why don't student housing contribute to public housing? Why are these things separate? So,
Exactly.
so these things are also the intelligence to bring the means together to improve both, rather than treat that and that and that. And this is maybe which he didn't succeed, but at least he did definitely try in a lot of the projects. And that's why I consider him experiments. Each time he failed, he changed his tactic. But what I find surprising is there is a lot of continuity coming back. I'll talk a little bit more later, but in the projects.
But you know, in the 1960s, 70s, maybe Disneyland was bad guys exploiting money from children and the family. Yeah. So maybe we have to get the good guy, the Jedi, to provide pampers. Okay. And then maybe it's there after the money. It's not considering about themselves. No. But I am running paper, okay? And honestly, just the organization is making money. We get about 30,000 visitors every month.
Isn't or is
Making money.
is making money.
And I'm not making money, but the organization is making money. 30,000 people coming, and each person is buying goods, and then each person is they're spending $150 per person. So the small museum creates easily $10 million each year. So is it but still we are doing the same. So maybe it's the measurement can be found.
Yes, the balance, the right balance. But it's you see that with museums, exhibitions, how to popularize them without making them simplistic, without making them into a kind of, let's say, amusement park. Serious topics, but they have to be fun as well. They have to be inviting. They have to be open to different populations.
Right? Fun. Okay. Now just to say the fun, right? You can get the fun from TV games and all kind of Game Boy, all the bad things. Okay. So
No, but it's like, for me, it's a little bit like when you make a joke or anecdote. It doesn't exist on its own. It helps to convey the message. So fun is not on its own. It's something that will open the door so that you want to know more, maybe.
Yes, open the door. I'm sorry, I'm not criticizing. I'm trying to.
No, I appreciate.
Help them to understand. What's going on, because it's not only historical reason. You are trying to open the door, to have more discussions and understandings of the fun.
Yeah, I wonder, so what is the future of play? What, I mean, I see, is it about sports? Is it about, how has it changed? There were criticisms about Aldo van Eyck's playgrounds. One is that the pieces are spaced apart, too far apart. So children don't really meet.
Exactly.
But the equipment itself is very interesting. It's kind of abstract, and they actually find that the people who use it, I mean the children, let's say, are more imaginative in the way they use it than a typical equipment. But now it's, it's dangerous or whatever. We don't see that anymore. But these are experiments that are important to not just throw away everything, but to learn from the good parts. And I think the Fun Palace as an idea keeps coming back for different reasons, because it has so many dimensions, like you already suggest.
So, question. Is it enough questions? Do you have any questions to him? But I know, shall we just move on to the word?
Do you want keywords?
I suggest that we have keywords tomorrow morning.
Okay.
No.
Yes.
Good, you have questions?
I didn't understand what was going on with Polyak this tree.
Yes.
And I was wondering what exactly they are doing during the tree.
Okay. So one idea was that maybe it would start from one school with the students, and they would come to present their work from a studio or something. So they had also tables they could design. There were videos learning with, architects like Buckminster Fuller. So it was like an educational mobile classroom. And they would come and then maybe do a presentation or maybe listen to a talk at a university. And the idea that some would get off and some would get on. So it was this kind of trip to create more connection between the schools.
So the bus is the place of the presentation and also the way to transport the students?
depended. I mean, I've seen pictures where they would park and then go to the school and then present, but also the bus sometimes served because they had equipment inside. They would sometimes set up in a parking lot, and so it could adapt. And in fact, one of the people, because it was a collaboration between AA School, one of the tutors, Cedric Price was not on the trip, but he set up, you know, the framework of the association. And then Peter Murray, who has continued this idea of bus tours. The idea that to show architecture, he takes a double-decker bus, invites architects, public who are interested, and takes them on tours of new architecture, neighborhoods, so that they become more aware of the neighborhood. I'll talk about some funny kind of ways, but Price was interested not so much to say, okay, this is what you should do, or even inform. Sometimes he's a little bit, let's say, mysterious, but he would want to provoke discussion about. And this is something I'll come back to. Sometimes he did it in very funny ways. But Peter Murray, I know, who I've talked to, is more about today. He said, you know, it's important to communicate. Price would be a little bit like, you know, some of the provoke you to make you think and defend your position, even if sometimes he would. He even said to one of his teaching assistant, who was Japanese, your role is to disagree with me all the time. So you're my assistant, so that we can have, so the students will become stronger to think for themselves. So I don't want just one person. So I think the interaction was an experiment to open up a dialogue, and in a way also in a very direct way, not just with technology.
So giving students hard time, okay?
Like we're doing.
Yeah, we are good at.
But I like what, you know, there's a bit of the low tech, high tech, there's the mix. And I think when we talk about hybrid, that's why, you know, some of the ideas are, it's very inclusive. It's not just one
There's
aesthetic.
one funny thing about this workshop, the double-decker, of classic style.
Hmm?
They didn't choose just the bus, double-decker. I think they were resistant.
Yeah.
What was the idea of financing the thing? How did they manage to, how did they think to manage the financing of such a huge facility?
The Fun Palace or the, one was a trust, so benefactors, so people who are wealthy, who are patrons of the arts. So this is, in a way, Price, like Littlewood, did live off a lot of people who believed in their work and gave them money. Other was to latch on to a cultural program, which was started by, I think, Janet Lee, of creating these community centers. So they were plugging into a program, and a lot of programs, education. So there were funding in the government for different programs. Their idea is to bring that in together for the Fun Palace. So it's an idea that's been used by, I think more recently, architects. I think of, I don't know, maybe it's not a very good example, you know, Aravena, about some of these big parks, about flooding. Well, the idea is not one funding. If you could put the budget of 3 different, let's say, ministries together that don't work together, you have more power. And it's not just for one thing. It's not just against flooding. You create a park, you create this. So that's what Price was doing with a lot of his projects, finding the funding in different areas and also developing not just one specific type of housing, but going across that spectrum, or trying. Yeah.
Did you work for free? Or share?
I don't think he worked for free, but he definitely gave sometimes lectures for free. For example, for workers' associations, for old ladies' clubs, and then others he would definitely get well paid. So depending, I don't know the numbers really. I wouldn't be able to say, but I know at least from having gone through, he gave like lectures almost 3 times a month, which is a lot, and sometimes in series in several days. So that interaction was really a habit. And there he kept a very precise logbook of being paid. And sometimes he would waive the fee. And so these were maybe, he believed, or maybe friends, but these he did to the end of his career. He was still quite active, giving talks for different publics. And maybe that's something I will try to talk about a little bit. That's what I think is extraordinary. He was not just talking to architects. He was talking to architects to say, wake up, we're giving a wrong message. Read what is in the press and what we're writing. And at the same time, he was talking to so many different publics. Yeah. So I think that's interesting what had been already said a little bit before, try to go beyond just, Price said it himself, architecture is too important to leave it to architects. So. But of course, it's serious.
How far did the project go?
The Fun Palace?
Yeah. Because you told me that he did the detailed drawing.
Yes.
Is it true?
There are execution drawings, and very far. According to Rainer Banham, he did all complete set of drawings. I have not gone through all the drawings, so I couldn't. But I have seen definitely detailed drawings. So it was not a diagram. There are definitely projects that are like that, and still enigmatic because the drawing is so approximative. But the Fun Palace is...
Civil engineer.
Yeah, sorry?
Who was the civil engineer?
Frank Newby. Frank Newby, yeah. So that's his main, let's say, partner. Each project also not only branches out into other projects, branches out into research groups. Frank Newby, they created the what's called Lightweight Enclosures Unit, LEU. And they did extensive research about inflatable, lightweight, light structures. And what's interesting is not that they would try to invent, they just actually just compiled a lot of information to make it accessible, easy to understand, made it like a bibliography, indexing. So that's the intelligence about not trying to reinvent it. It's just the question of having access to it. So in terms of now, today, we think about reuse and things. Sometimes the question is just to map it and give access to it rather than think you can be the center of everything.
How come that Lawrence Snowdon is the co-author of the Alien?
Well, he got the commission.
He got the commission.
Yeah, it was him. And I think Price, through his connections, from, what's his name, the guy who planned the park, the zoo, the master planner of the park, Kaysen, or I forget, recommended to work with Price.
How come that he got the commission?
Through the royal family, his connections. He was the husband of,
Yeah, I know.
yes.
But he was a photographer, not an engineer.
Well, he did architecture studies, and he met Price in Cambridge, so they knew each other. So there's a lot of early projects that are Cambridge connection. Yeah.
So there was no competition.
Yeah, maybe I showed that's definitely Price did not build a lot, and the most important building that still exists is the London Aviary in the London Zoo, which is being, I think, restored or maybe finished by Lord Norman Foster.
Good.
Keywords?
Perfect.
Thank you.
Tomorrow. We are a little bit exhausted.
I am too.
Yeah. You too.
Yes, yes.
Okay, let's have a bit.
Yeah, good. Thank you.